Strata Unscripted is back, and this time Katharine and I are joined by Sat Harwood of Lesperance Mendes. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
For those that don't know you already, Sat, give us a brief introduction to you and the firm.
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Sat Harwood. I'm the managing partner here at Lesperance Mendes Lawyers in Vancouver. I have had the privilege of being a strata lawyer since 2007, so quite a while now, and that's given me a lot of exposure to the good, the bad, and the ugly of strata living and strata governance.
Absolutely. Katharine, you had a special agenda for us today.
Yes, because I was letting my brain, and I was kind of pondering this idea of strata reform. I saw yet another call to action, line about how we need change. SPA needs to be totally overhauled. Everything's a nightmare. If we just had more rules, we'd be happy. And I just was driving and I started laughing, and I was like, well, this is like the chicken and the egg. Which one comes first? Do we have more laws, or do we need to shift our culture and behavior? And to me, there is no answer. And I was like, who we should bring on to talk about this one is a lawyer, because you guys really like black and white, and I do not. So that's where that came from today.
Excellent. Well, I also think in black and white, Sat, so you're not alone. What do you think about
making fun of him a lot for it too, by the way, so be warned accordingly. There'll be some mild teasing at certain points. But yeah, thoughts to you when you think of the Strata Property Act, as people have been saying, it needs to be changed, it needs a reform. When you look at your career and your experiences with strata corporations and the disputes that come along with it, what's your stance on whether or not we need more rules, or if it's probably more of a paradigm shift in behavior and culture?
Yeah, I mean, not surprising as a lawyer, I think there's always a need for more rules and better rules. I think that the field of strata governance is one that has really evolved in leaps and bounds over the last couple of decades. And what coming along with that is, of course, the fact that as stratas become more complicated, as community living becomes more and more a way of life, we really need more rules, more guidelines as to what is considered to be sort of acceptable and not acceptable behavior, what provides more clarity to sort of key governance issues or things of that sort. I think that the benefit to a more detailed set of rules is predictability, right? People know what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. They know what the processes are for bringing about certain changes. And if you have those things, it's much easier for people to forward plan and hopefully avoid some of the conflicts that we see popping up time and time again in the strata realm.
Just a further question to that too, and because I've seen it kind of go both ways. You said where there needs to be better, good rules, and I like that you specified that clearly, because sometimes what I've seen in my professional experience is that there'll be buildings where they have the most detailed, legally reviewed bylaws in the universe. They're 60 to 80 pages long. And then there's those buildings that literally have slightly hackneyed versions of the standard bylaws, but they have an ownership that respects each other and trusts each other and is working towards the greater good. And they are arguably far more functional than building A over here too. So when we look at different examples, I think also too, as a lawyer, where have you seen that changes to SPA have been really well received and adopted versus the times where you've watched changes in history to SPA or the regulations and you're like, ooh, okay, I maybe wouldn't have rolled it out that way or approached it this way instead? Yeah, I'd be curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't think of a particular example where the rollout has been done wrong. I think that as strata lawyers, we're always looking for detail, and we're looking for regulatory changes that really sort of run the gamut of all the different scenarios that can emerge in that field. And I don't mean this as a critique of the government, but sometimes we, as sort of on the government side of things, you take a cautious approach to things, and so you sort of roll stuff out in a sort of small and staggered manner, which is to be expected, because big change also tends to lead to bigger blowback, right? But you end up getting situations where the change has been perhaps less ambitious, but as a result of that, it hasn't really addressed all of the scenarios or the situations that you see emerging, right? So, I'll give an example, and it's again not to critique, but if you look at something like the implementation of the depreciation report regime, right? Super valuable tool. It's a great resource for strata corporations when they engage in financial planning, when they look to the future and what sort of repairs and maintenance are needed for their community. Very valuable tool for purchasers as well, when you're buying in, to get a sense of what's coming up in terms of significant bills or repair work that needs to get done. But there is a disconnect between that and then how do you get to actually bringing in those repairs, right? And that disconnect is to some degree inevitable, right? Like if you look at a strata community, there's always going to unfortunately be situations where different owners have different financial means when it comes to covering their share of the costs of a big repair bill. But by not having sort of a clear line from the reporting process through to the funding resolution, you do see a lot of situations where what I would say are sort of needed or inevitably critical repairs and maintenance get punted down the road because the community can't get to a consensus on how to fund those things. And then inevitably what ends up happening is the cost of repairs is greater, right? And so everybody pays more because of the lag time between getting from the reporting to the implementation stage. And so, I don't say that to critique anybody, but it is the reality of strata living, that if you don't have a clear regime to get from reporting to funding, delays are going to happen and it's going to cost people more money.
That's a really great observation. I know Catherine's got stuff to say on this, but I'm jumping in because I feel there's also a huge disconnect between the reporting and the funding. And British Columbia, unlike Alberta or Ontario, has a massive shortfall in terms of CRF funding compared to the other markets where they need to be adequately funded. And in other markets, the decision to proceed with those projects as recommended in their reserve studies or their depreciation reports is taken by the board. So there's no going back to get owners to approve a levy and approve a project. The board is taking the action that's necessary when it's necessary, and the funds are in place. It's just a huge difference. Go ahead, Katharine.
No, and that's one way to do it, right? You can put in rules and force people to do it. Again, you're going to have different kinds of pushback to that way of doing it. And again, because I've had buildings which are remarkably similar in terms of the demographic and socioeconomic status of the residents inside. So it wasn't necessarily a willingness or lack of willingness to spend money, but it was because it's how they had always done things, either wrong way or right way. Okay, bad wording per se, not so dichotomized, but one building every year at the AGM, they looked at the depreciation report and talked about which projects they were going to be proposing next year for funding to be started the year after. So that way this year we're voting on something that we already talked about last year that you've already been preparing for, that we're going to do this summer. And then, it was always like a one step backwards forwards. And I found that they planned really well because also the owners showed up literally with their checkbooks. It was the expectation socially that we take care of our building. We have pride for our building. This was a building on completely income capped seniors, same as many others in the area. And that ends up being a big excuse a lot. Well, we're income capped, we're seniors, we're on CPP. I've seen two kinds of seniors buildings, really well funded ones and really well planned ones, and then not. And so to me, it was the culture shift. Like, you have to be willing to be a villager and come in there ready to spend your money, because it can't just be that the powers up here say you must spend, because then you're always going to get those people who are like, excuse me, you said I have to, well now I'm going to do the opposite.
It doesn't happen in Alberta or Ontario, though.
Really? You don't get people
law
who are
is
contrary in Alberta and Ontario?
they have no choice. The funding requirements
Yes, but
there.
that doesn't mean it makes it less painless. It just makes a different kind of pain. I bet you they have more issues with liens and for sales and stuff throughout their history. I'm not saying they do, I'm just guessing.
I guess if I could jump in, I would sort of, my view on it, for what it's worth, is it's a bit of, I see a bit of a halfway house between the two models. My concern with a regime like the one in Ontario is that when you put all the decision-making powers in the hands of the board in their case, or the council in our case, I've been doing this enough to see that there are avenues for corruption and other sorts of bad things going on, right? I think also too, if you put that decision-making power purely in the hands of the board or the council, there's a greater risk, even without concerns around corruption or things like that, but there's a greater risk of a disconnect between the decision-making of council and what the ownership actually wants for their community in terms of priorities. Where I could see a valuable change would be in the funding mechanisms for the CRF and the levels of funding that are required to go to the CRF. So you're not, in that kind of a model, you're not saying, okay, Strata Council, you're just going to make all the decisions. Still has to be subject to a vote of the owners. But there is more funding that is going to the CRF, more savings that are being put aside. So when you get to these owner votes, it's not that financial burden on owners is not so great. You're not having to rely on levies as much. There is cash in the bank, and then the owners have to decide, okay, well, we've got 3 priorities. Which of the ones are we going to tackle this year? Which are the ones are we going to save and deal with at a later date? That's not going to a limit of levies, but at least it reduces it, right?
But like what you've described is the common sense that a lot of people aren't just like born out of grade school with, right? So like the piece that's always missing to me, and I really love that you picked depreciation reports because it is a really complex one. And personally, Stratagal is a huge fan of depreciation reports. I love them. They are knowledge. Knowledge is power. But when it was unrolling, I feel like it was more like, this is the thing we have to do. And it was talked about from the perspective of purchasers and mortgage holder or mortgagees and engineers and lawyers, and it wasn't talked about like to the lay people on the ground, like, hey, there's this super cool tool we're going to give you. You know how all these problems you're having, like with not knowing building components and ages of buildings and funding planning, we're going to help you figure something out that is like the best in the world. We're going to, as we're rolling this out, we're going to walk you through it every step of the way. We're going to give you education how to apply this in your building. Guaranteed that rollout would have been remarkably different. And like the thing that comes to my head is HST. How did that roll out in different provinces so terribly, horribly versus not? Education. So I'm just like, that to me, I always come back to, and not just because of my livelihood. So.
I love the middle ground, Sat. Yes, if we had proper funding, everything would be less of a surprise. Katharine pointed out earlier that it's not that there aren't unhappy condo owners in Alberta or Ontario, but they're paying, $700-800 of condo fees each month. BC's paying $500, and then a lottery ticket for when you get the bill for a special levy. And it's like, well, you just bought your condo. It was built in 1995. Your condo fees are $500, and next year you get an $18,000 special levy. Meanwhile, if you bought across the street, it would be a $50,000 special levey. Or if you got really lucky, you got one that was properly funded or better funded, and there's nothing for the next 7, 8, 10 years. And I think that's where the disconnect really hits, and that's been a big part of the focus of the work that we've done in the space. So I like that, let's move what we can and leave control with the owners, but make sure that they're in a position to make a better decision, not a kick it down the road one.
Like teach them how to critically think along with rolling out these changes about how they can best implement it in their building, and give them some tools that are not the level of a lawyer or a tradesperson or an engineer, but we have to get this idea out of our head that, oh, people will just go, it's their job, it's their responsibility. They shouldn't have signed up for counsel if they didn't want the responsibility of educating themselves. Well, guess what? More often than not nowadays, that will be the decision made by most people. And it's like a struggle to find council members. So like on as a lawyer side of things too, like you would have seen a lot of circumstances where you have to defend because you're on a side of certain like whichever party has engaged you. But like, and you can argue either way, and there'll always be basis in every case because there's two sides of every story, to be clear, not because one is right or wrong. But like, how many times in your career have you seen disputes get way too far along that were not really about the law and people were not seeing each other?
That's a huge one. I mean, I think that probably 50% of all of the disputes that we get involved with as strata lawyers are first and foremost interpersonal disputes between people who are having difficulty communicating with one another. It's, you know, people, that the challenge with living in communal living is that you have to share space with people. But we inevitably as humans get caught up in our own lives and our own situations, and we don't always pay enough attention to our neighbors and their needs and their situations because we're just trying to get through our own days. I think that, I've been to a lot of general meetings, and usually as a lawyer, when I get called to a general meeting, it's because there is a concern that things are going to get out of hand, or decisions that need to be made are going to get torpedoed because people don't understand the value of the decision they're being asked to make. Inevitably, when you go to those meetings, I mean, my goal as a lawyer in those meetings is always to try to, obviously, to talk through the law and the need for certain decisions to be made or not made, but also, I try to do that in a way that gives some credibility to the differing points of view. Even people that attend general meetings, even when their opinions are legally incorrect, usually that view is coming from a personal concern, and that concern usually has validity to it. And so it's a question of finding ways to acknowledge that concern, to give that person a forum to express their concerns, but then to gently explain to them why what they're advocating for, unfortunately, isn't something that can be achieved because of provisions in the act or whatever. And so, I think if you can do that as a strata lawyer, I think if you can do that as a council member or as a manager, your meetings will go more smoothly. Your relations with the communities that you serve will be better because people aren't going to necessarily get along all the time, but at least they will feel that they've been heard.
And I think sometimes too, we know as strata managers or as council ownerships or strata councils, that we know when those meetings and circumstances are going to arise. And I would argue in that case that the investment in having a lawyer at the meeting will save you both your sanity and future funds, in that the right information will be conveyed and documented in the right way. And there won't be as much of a chance for emotional deregulation that causes further damage interpersonally to the strata. And like there's circumstances too where if you chose not to proceed with a lawyer, again, you could end up with the strata themselves getting sued or worse. There's been times where, and I'm not saying this is any of your clients, or mine, I'm not saying that at all. But there's been records lots and lots of times of people getting into physical altercations because they just can't hear each other, or they're so convinced that they are the right person that they literally physically push each other's ideas, in a sense, because that's how I like to think of it. It's not even that I don't like you, you don't like, we just don't want to hear that we might even be talking past each other, I think a lot of the time. I also think it was interesting where you said, like, we have to become a place where people can be heard, because I also think that there's a lot of strata ownerships and institutions, even within the industry, where criticism, feedback, people speaking up about things that are happening that are difficult challenges in the industry are basically treated like that complaint itself is the problem and not the underlying problem that's being brought to the council or institution's attention. And I think sometimes too, that if we are not accepting different ideas and examining other opinions than our own, then it's not going to help us within that institution to create more rules, because we're only going to be creating more rules from our one-dimensional perspective in there. And they're probably going to be more heavily weighted to our own benefit, even subconsciously, to be honest. So I think, it's challenging, right? I'd be curious too, how many times have you also seen like where there's been a council that you've had to defend, and no details, but that they're really out of line and that they're wasting their own money. And I mean, you're happy to take their business, but wasting your time, and ultimately probably hurting themselves.
Yeah, I've definitely had that a couple of times over the years. My approach in dealing with those situations is, first and foremost, I start by, sort of explaining to the council why the position they've taken on an issue isn't correct, and why ultimately I think the CRT or the courts would rule against them if it came down to it. When I've been involved in those situations, I've often had requests from councils to attend general meetings or to attend information meetings to talk about those issues. And I've always been clear to councils in those cases, look, my role in this is, essentially I am a servant of the Strata Corporation itself. I take directions from council, but my client is the Strata Corporation, and my job is to ensure that the Strata Corporation gets the best advice I can give it. And I caution councils in those cases, look, I'm happy to attend your meeting. I'm happy to talk through the issues. I will certainly spend some time giving some explanation to some of the factors that you were weighing when you went down a particular path. But inevitably, if I'm asked to comment on the propriety of a decision, or a potential decision, I have to give people my unfiltered view as to what the correct interpretation of the law is going to be in that area. And so you need to understand that, if I come there, I'm going to say stuff that maybe doesn't necessarily support your opinion, but I'll try to give a balanced and a fulsome view so that all sides feel that they've been heard. And
I think it helps that you guys usually have a really, I was going to say, it helps that usually you lawyers, you guys have a really even tone when you're delivering news. I find that helps. Like, be like, yes, and the damage is going to be in excess of 3.5 million. Like, okay, yeah, cool.
Yeah, it does help. I mean, I think, I don't know.
I don't have that skill.
If you lose control of a meeting, it's very hard to get it back, right? And so I try to, as best I can, be even keel in these meetings. The other thing I think too, and this is probably just a bit of a philosophical take on it because I've been doing it long enough, but I've been to enough meetings where you go to one meeting and your current instructing client is whoever, some members of council or whatever, but AGMs occur, stratas are a democracy, and the people that are instructing you one day may not be the people that are instructing you the next day. And so I think that if you recognize that, it will motivate you to sort of navigate stuff with a bit of grace, because you never know who your instructing principles are going to be. It's subject to change, and your directions are subject to change. And so I think if you can treat all sides in a dispute or disagreement with a measure of respect and candor, then it makes things smoother no matter what happens to that strata.
That is incredibly wise. It would have helped me the other day when I got pulled over for a traffic stop because I rolled my eyes at the cop car. So don't recommend. Don't do that. Talking about some of these like more dysfunctional stratas, yes, we've, they fight, they do this, they don't see each other. what would you say, in your professional opinion, and the patterns that you've seen? And Thomas, I'd be curious to get your perspective looking at the multitude of reports. What seems to interpersonally, looking at not just the rules, but their behavior and rules, maybe what differentiates the functional councils? Not perfect, not like, oh my God, we got everything glistening and perfect, but like what separates the ones that get stuff done and the ones that don't?
Well, yeah, you go first. I'm thinking about what I should look into.
Honestly, stewing over the tea, as the kids say these days. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that I see frequently emerge in dysfunctional councils. In some cases, it's council members that sort of reverse personal interest with strata interest, right? People are human, and inevitably a big important decision comes up and you think, well, how does this impact me, right? And some people put the focus on their own personal impact ahead of the council or the strata impact. So I think that's a big factor. I think economics, like we talked about earlier, can be a big factor.
Although, to be honest, I've had some buildings that had like marble countertops in Deep West Van, and I could not stand them as much as the little, like, little 3-story walk up in wherever in East Van. Like, so socioeconomics can certainly help when you can like have enough of a comfort buffer that people can afford things without pulling out their teeth, but it's not the be all end all.
No, it's not. And where the socioeconomic intends to flare up is if you have quite a diversity of means, right? Because then people might have different interests.
Like if you've seen the value of the building spike quite a lot, and you have a divide between original owners and new family owners who are very different mortgage structures than each other. We talked about this a little bit in one of the last.
You can see that. Like, I mean, ethnocultural conflicts can pop up too, and those are always like those are really tricky ones to navigate. But the reality is that they do pop up in stratas.
I thought in the city a lot more. Wherever you get more diversity, you do get some more conflicts.
Yeah.
I've seen it a little bit less out here in Chilliwack, but
yeah,
so far.
Yeah, you see that. Mental health issues can pose a challenge, and I use that term in a really broad sort of sense, right? But there's lots of people who are struggling with those sorts of health issues these days, in any sort of demographic, in any sort of real estate market. But when you have those within a strata corporation, either where you're dealing with challenges with an owner or you're dealing with challenges with people who are on council, that can really make things difficult and occupy a lot of time. When I got into practicing strata law, I thought a lot of it was, it was just about dealing with the law and legal perspectives and legal issues. But I've been doing this long enough to know that having some good, what I'll call counseling skills as a lawyer, some good interpersonal skills, some good empathy skills really go a long way, because you will be at many times in your career dealing with people who are struggling with mental health or physical health issues, and to be able to try to navigate those things with some grace and compassion, I think goes a long way as well.
Curiosity and compassion are excellent qualities in leadership. So those of you on strata councils out there, start with that first. Thomas, what separates the good ones that get stuff done and that you've seen? Like data-wise, even, because you won't have the same
preparedness perspective. Those that are adequately funded for the near-term projects always have a smoother go of things. When you look at community operation and strata councils, again, trying to find better alignment and mix of skills is really helpful. And when we look at the bylaw notices and the discussion of bylaws within the documents, and we've seen 250,000 of these discussions, beyond discussion of fines and bylaws themselves. The biggest categories are parking and vehicle infractions, followed by common area misuse, noise, garbage, and then pretty much tied pets, smoking, safety, and security. So it's kind of interesting to see that cascade. I'm sure that both of you, given your experience in the industry, have seen that reflected. And there are some that, despite being mentioned last, like rentals, have higher fine amounts because of the nature of those violations and what that means. Sat, in your experience, how big are these relative issues to one another, and what do you see on the ground?
Yeah, I think I see these issues pop up time and time again. I think also too that when they do pop up, they tend to occupy a significant portion of the council and the manager's time.
Yeah.
So, I sometimes joke with people that there's, in any given strata building, there's like two owners that occupy 85% of the council's time, and then the other basket of owners, whether it's 2 or it's 150 owners, occupy 20% of the time. And so, yeah, you do inevitably see that popping up a lot. And when those issues pop up, part of it is because of the people involved, but it's also the impact that it has on the community at large, right? Like, if you are an owner in a building and your neighbor upstairs has a propensity to hold parties, your life at home is miserable, right? Because you're constantly being kept awake at night. And it's, like, your home is supposed to be your sanctuary, your respite from the chaos of your work world or whatever issues that you're dealing with in life. That's the place that you can go and wind down and do all those things. But if the ceiling is vibrating every evening because of the parties upstairs, it becomes really difficult to function.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that 1 to 2, if you've attended any of my trainings, I have a character. His name is Bob Robertson. He represents literally all of that two guys, basically, or two people, sorry. So just to be clear, it's not a real Bob if you've ever attended training. He just is the amalgamation of what exactly Sat has talked about here. I have another question too. Like, so legitimately we've talked theoretical chicken egg behavior laws, whatever, but down to brass tacks, I'm suddenly magical and I have a magic wand and I'm like, Sat Harwood, what do you want me to change on SPA? What would you want me to change?
Yeah, so interestingly, because the last few moments we've been talking about some of the interpersonal issues and mental health issues and these sorts of things. I actually don't have a suggestion there, because I think to some degree, that's just part of life, right? And navigating those things, you can't legislate those things into a space where you don't have a problem with those, right? But I will say that when you look at the Strata Property Act, when you look at areas of dispute that pop up time and time again, where you're like, we could actually deal with this from a legislative standpoint quite simply. I think you look at the definition of common property in the Strata Property Act. Super boring topic. Why are we going there? Well, I can't tell you the number of times that an owner and a strata corporation have got into a dirt throwing match over who's responsible for fixing something, right? When you look at things like pipes and ducts and electrical components and all this sort of stuff, anytime there's a problem, a strata inevitably comes to their manager, or they come to me or some other strata lawyer out there, they come to Katharine and they're like, who's responsible for this, right? And so the definition in the Act, the way that it tries to balkanize areas that are a strata responsibility from areas that are an owner responsibility, it's a mess. And when a strata comes to me and they're like, hey, we've got this mechanical component inside a wall in a strata, who's responsible for it? I'm like, well, I can tell you what the definition says, but I'm going to have to go and see what the latest CRT case says from the last 3 days, because the case from a week ago, it might be a different outcome now, right? So
you answer questions like me. I don't ever give them a real answer. I'm like, well, it depends.
That's a good lawyer.
And actually, I have just came up with a new article I was going to write based on a similar thing. It's interesting you said common property. So for this story is going to be called the Hardy Board Sisters and the Clue of the Garage Door Damage. Because this was the thing too, is about the division of CP, LCP, and strata lots is incredibly confusing to most people who live in strata. So I love that you said that.
Yeah, it's a big one, right? And like when you look at let's say it's a 100-story strata building, it's a 10-story concrete high rise or whatever, right? If you look at a building like that, the lion's share of the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, whatever, fire suppression system equipment, the lion's share of it by a huge margin is going to be a strata responsibility, right? It's that small portion that might be an owner's responsibility that inserts a measure of vagueness to the dispute that inevitably leads to legal disputes. Again, I don't mean that critically, but it eats up a lot of CRT time to deal with those issues. If there was a bit more of a hard and fast rule, like this is a strata responsibility, full stop, it will simplify that. It'll reduce the amount of CRT time that is eaten up dealing with these issues. It will reduce the amount of time that managers have to come and consult lawyers like me about who's responsible. It just makes it a lot more straightforward. Now,
I love that, but I'm going to disagree. As soon as you come up with a new definition, there's going to be another Bob that wants to argue with it.
But Katharine, you shared that CRT case where the decision was made mostly in favor of an owner for a leak that originated in their unit.
Mm-hmm.
And the person that decided that particular case somehow said that the standard of neglect of their property met the barrier of negligence on the part of the owner, and that the owner wasn't negligent. And I'm like, negligence and neglect are different things.
I know which case you're talking about, and I really
Right.
shouldn't speculate because I was a strata manager for that building at the time. And I'm just going to say they clearly did not have all the definition 5 years or all the documentation 5 years later when the case was actually decided. So hint, go to a better software program or file system, or like don't change companies or managers 5 times during a major litigation. Just by the way, bad idea because you'll lose a lot of information. But yeah, no, I zip a lip. No comment on that one.
Okay, fair. But no, I like Sat's point. I think that could be really clear. And Katharine used some strata lingo there, that the CP is the common property and the LCP is the limited common property. And then there's, that
SL, LCP, CP. Yes. We love acronyms in strata. Like it's really fun. We just make stuff up all the time just to confuse people. It's great. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? And do you need any legal advice for anything while we got him here, Thomas? Anything?
Well, I mean, I guess it would be helpful to understand when somebody should be contacting you, Sat. What are the ideal circumstances for a strata corporation to be reaching out?
Yeah, I mean, well, I always joke with people that it's much cheaper to contact a lawyer at the front end than at the back end after a dispute has already blown up. I think that sort of general statement is fairly true across the board. But jokes aside, I mean, I do think that getting advice, if you get to a situation where you can see a dispute emerging, where this is going to happen, where there is a disagreement amongst owners or between council and a particular owner, getting advice at the front end is really critical, right? Time and time again, what we see in the CRT is situations where a strata corporation has got to that adjudication phase, and then a decision comes out, and it's very clear that the bylaws were breached, that something was done wrong, and then time and time again, the strata loses the case because it didn't follow proper bylaw enforcement procedures, or it doesn't have evidence on a particular point that is critical to the decision-making process, right? And so it's an awful situation for a strata to be in because they've invested so much time so much money into getting justice on a particular issue, and then they lose because of a technicality or a lack of preparedness, right? That's not to say
And also,
that
don't try to attempt CRT stuff without the assistance of a lawyer, especially where the dollar value is creeping up there. Please, folks, please call your lawyer.
No, it's true, right? Like, it's just you save money on one side and then you lose on the other, so you end up in a worse position, right? And obviously, like, as lawyers, like, we're very happy to help stratas all the way through the process, and sort of guide them each step of the way. But we recognize, like, not everybody has the same financial means to hire lawyers. So, but sometimes people come to us and they just want advice at the front end, right? Or midway through the process. And obviously, if we're not involved full time, we can't sort of steer you through every argument that you need to make. But at least we can help to guide you to avoid some of those big critical pieces, right? And a lot of them are just like, had you done that homework at the front end, had you issued the proper 135 notice, or had you collected good evidence that somebody was breaching your no Airbnb bylaw, you wouldn't be in a situation where your claim is tossed out because of these sort of technical shortcomings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Well, I'm going to risk throwing up a QR code and we'll see where it floats over us here. Yeah, right over you, Sat. So you're now invisible, but scan that code. There he is, hiding behind it. Excellent. Well, look him up, connect with Sat. We will hide that code because I was worried it was going to land over one of us.
Yeah,
as long as it's not me, it's fine.
Yeah. That's right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sat. Really fascinating insights there. I think it would also be worth many stratas updating their bylaws. It has been a long time for many communities. Is that work that your team helps with?
Yeah, all the time. I think on any given week, I probably have 6 or 7 bylaw amendment processes on the go.
Right. Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you for clarifying that. Katharine, anything to wrap us up?
No, because if I start going, I'm going to go down a whole other digression. So
excellent. Well, thanks, Sat. We'll have you back.
Thank you very much, guys.